So the concept of forgiveness seems to be everywhere these days, if not entirely overtly. We talk about the need to forgive, and certainly the stakes have been raised a lot this year, and so the need to think about forgiveness is probably higher than what we've had to do ordinarily. Now, if this morning you looked up on Amazon any sort of idea about forgiveness, if you were to just search for it, you'll find just over 35,000 results. And most of these books are same-day delivery, so if you're looking for an immediate, quick fix on forgiveness, you're only a few hours away from satisfaction. And I was skimming the titles, I found that most of them had to do with the individual reading the book. So what I mean by that is what happens when I've been offended. And apparently if I'm willing to forgive, then I'll feel better. I won't be so given to anger or to resentment. And my best life is one where I'm willing to forgive for my benefit. However, we struggle with that a lot, right? Otherwise, there wouldn't be a market for forgiveness essential oils and forgiveness earrings, which is true. If you were to go onto Amazon and you're really struggling, like you need more than just the words, you can just breathe in forgiveness and you can wear forgiveness. But yeah, if all we needed was like a book, we wouldn't need this stuff. Or if we didn't struggle with forgiveness at all, we wouldn't even have a market for it. I think it's hard, how do we conceptualize forgiving someone 7 times? And in this text, Peter certainly thinks he's going above and beyond the call for forgiveness. Later writings by rabbis suggest that the most one ever needed to forgive somebody was 3 times. So, listen, Peter's already doing good if he's got 3. He doubles that and then adds another one for good measure, right? The number of completeness. I've forgiven folks 7 times, Jesus. Isn't that enough? But according to Jesus, he's about 532 times short. So how do we forgive people? Somebody, you're going to go to the store tomorrow. You're excited about it. Maybe you're really excited about getting some steak. You're pumped about getting a really good dinner, and you're really good about wearing your mask. And all of a sudden, you go in, and like half the people aren't wearing a mask, and now you're frustrated. Now that steak isn't going to taste as good. Now you're second-guessing whether you should go into the store or stay out of it. And now you don't know if people are going to be angry, and now you've got to somehow forgive them when you know that steak you were excited about is not going to taste good. Or let's say somebody cuts you off in traffic. Or let's say you're wanting to come to the outdoor service, which at least as of right now seems like it's going to happen. But you go outside there and you want to sit underneath a specific portion of shade, and somebody else now is sitting in that portion of shade, and now you are throwing shade on somebody else. It's hard to forgive. I mean, not to mention the stuff that we're not having to think about right now, like what happens if somebody sits in your pew? The folks who want to use the plates that are sitting, the ones who don't want to use the plates that are sitting in the cabinets, all of that. Not to mention just life. How do I forgive my child who doesn't want to do her schoolwork online? How do I forgive the teacher who provides 10 times the assignment to my daughter than the teacher who assigns stuff to my son? And I'm sure I am not the only one who feels that way. So you can see, after a while, if every incident you have to start the clock of forgiveness over again, 539 times of forgiveness gets exhausting. And as we walk through this part of Matthew, we're waiting for a thorough explanation of how to forgive. And yet Jesus seems to take a hard left turn, right, into a story about kings and servants. And as Jesus begins to unfold this story, we're presented with a king who seems by all indications doing a very mundane job. And I apologize for those of you who are accountants who are watching, but let's be honest, this is not like highbrow kingly duties, sending people off to war or sitting on the throne talking to people. The king is doing some kind of accounting. He's managing his assets and he's settling his debts. This is not, again, the thing of King Arthur lore. I've never seen a King Arthur book about King Arthur manages the balance sheet. So shortly after, we hear of the first slave coming into the king's presence, and we are told that he owes 10,000 talents. And while I was preparing, I was trying to get a sense of how much that actually is. And while there's plenty of different ways to consider it, the best way to imagine the amount that this individual owes the king is that it is the number that Jesus uses. It's the largest single number that the Greek could express, and that the talent was the largest currency for the time. So even all of the tributes of Galilee and Perea during the time of Jesus' time on earth would have amounted to 200 talents, right? So take a whole country, 2 countries, and we're not even close to 10,000 talents. In other words, it's almost as if Jesus is saying to us that the servant owes 1170 Google trillion dollars. Like, just ask one of the kids in the house, like, what's the biggest number you can think of? And that's what Jesus is saying the slave owes to the king. Another source that I looked at said it would likely have taken the slave 60 to 100 million days to pay off that debt. So in other words, it ain't going to happen. And moreover, as a slave, the individual here had forfeited all of his own rights. He had no claim even on his own life. At the end of the day, this individual now is an asset on the king's balance sheet. And given the nature of the relationship, it was totally within the king's purview to have just ignored this slave and to just have had him pay. He was indentured for the entire rest of his life. But still, the king listens, and the king has mercy. Y'all probably are tired of me bringing up this word that comes up a lot of times, but the New Revised Standard Version, this word might just be rendered pity, but it's much deeper than that. It's the same word, this esplanchoniste that I talk about, which means that, again, the king's guts were literally ripped out in emotional pity for this individual. And we've seen this a couple more times in Matthew. When Jesus saw the hungry people and turns the food, the meager loaves and fishes, to feed the 5,000 plus. It's the same feeling the prodigal father has when he sees his son returning. It's the same feeling that the Samaritan had towards the person who is on the other side of the road. And this is the same feeling that this king had for this servant who owed so much. You know for a fact his credit score is under 500. Like, dude doesn't even get a credit score. It's that bad. And the king had such deep feeling for him, it's like his guts were coming out. His stomach was turned inside out. The king was moved viscerally by the slave. The king was moved viscerally by the servant. He was pained in the same way Jesus was when he saw thousands of hungry people. His feeling was a deep towards the servant, just as the prodigal father was as he saw his once thought dead son come to him. This feeling, by the way, was sufficient enough that the king was willing to move beyond the power of his position, beyond the economic systems at play, and connected with the servant person to person and forgave him. And I think this is such an important point, I want to repeat it again. And I'm probably going to throw the words verbatim right up here. This feeling was sufficient enough, this feeling of overwhelming visceral reaction to this slave was sufficient enough that the king was willing to move beyond the power of his position, where he had no reason to do what he did, beyond the economic systems at play, which allowed this person just to be an asset, and connected with a slave person to person, lowest to the highest, and forgave him. This was not, by the way, sorry, Amazon, this was not about the king feeling better about himself. In fact, when we consider what he lost, it's probably the opposite. The king lost 10,000 talents, 1170 Google billion dollars, infinity money. Not to mention an asset of human life that, as despicable as we find it now, we can at least recognize that the human life, as precious as it is worth a lot. So not only did the king lose human value, but also lost, again, 10,000 talents. But he did it anyway, because the feelings deep in his body would not allow him to do anything else. This is so nice. This is great. And Jesus gives us about one period's length of time before we start to get, here's what's happening next. Immediately after we're presented to this beautiful scene where the slave is now free, we're presented with this slave confronting one of his peers. And it's clear from the outset the dynamics between the two individuals is different. Remember that this is not a king to a servant. The forgiven slave has no claim over this other person except a pittance of debt. If you remember the 100 million days of debt the first servant had, the comparison of the second servant is somewhere around 1 day's worth of minimum wage. And I can't do that math in my head, but again, it's going to be right here to give you the comparison. 1 day's debt. And interestingly enough, the second servant pleads with the same exact words as the first slave. Please have patience with me. But clearly they make no impact with the now forgiven, debt-cleared, credit score at 800 servant. Instead, he imposes his own personal will on the second slave through violence and through legal means to be able to exact his repayment and have power over the other slave. And if any of you, which I will just fully admit that I've had this happen when I was younger, and had a medical debt from OSU that I had been fighting about to get paid. But if you've ever had a debt collector harass you over the phone, I think you might just have had a glimpse of what this second slave went through. And yet, we consider that that's part of the way our system works, right? I mean, at the end of the day, yeah, maybe the first slave shouldn't have throttled the second one, but certainly found other ways to make sure that he was going to get his. It doesn't seem as though the first servant necessarily did anything completely illegal, assault aside. Yet the end of this whole parable then leaves us with a difficult resolve. The curtain closes with the wrath of the king coming upon the first servant, and both of them are given over to the debt warden. And it's not likely that either one of them, the first or the second servant, is going to see peace or freedom. In fact, if we take Matthew's retelling at its word, at least one of the servants is headed towards torture. So how do we resolve this beyond some kind of scary story that we might be apt to yell at our bickering children when, again, it's like the last time? If you don't forgive your brother, you'll be in trouble. You'll get thrown to the debt collector, and you're going to be in a lot of trouble. I don't think it'll work very well, because if kids really had a sense of debt, they wouldn't ask for so many things when you go on trips. So, it might not be the most apt metaphor, but certainly if you don't forgive your sibling, you're going to be in a heap of trouble. I think in the end, what happens here is it comes down to our compassion, our humanness, and our recognition of both. In Jesus' story, the forgiven slave is not evil because he ran up a large debt. He isn't evil because he had begged for relief from his debt. He is only considered wicked when he is unwilling to extend the same gut-wrenching concern to another that actually leads to forgiveness. And even though the first servant was simply taking care of what was his and could have rightfully earned, his actions were performed in such a way that ignores the shared humanity of his peer. Our moves away from communal deep concern, joy, and pain for another, irrespective of social and political positions, is ultimately a zero-sum game, rendering us only to a series of numbers and accounts, simple entries on a balance sheet of a king that honestly has no reason to pay attention to you. If there's one thing that we as Christians have in our toolboxes for times like now, is that we have darn good reason to care about things that honestly the rest of the world would say, why are you worried about that? Why are you worried about poor folks? Why are you worried about people who don't have the same voice that you do? We have a reason to. But if we don't, then again, it's a zero-sum game, and it renders us only to the very base, terrible reality of a world that's ran by capital, that we're just numbers and accounts, and what we provide and perform and what we owe. And I think, if we're honest with ourselves, there's been plenty of times that we felt that way this year. That we're nothing but political pawns. We're not really our value. And so maybe we project that on others. Maybe we project that in what we say. Maybe we project that in the way that we respond to people who in other times we might care more deeply about. And when we live into a world that emphasizes our own lives and our own concerns of getting up by satisfying our needs, then we are thrown into the same prison that we sent others, abdicating the forgiveness that deep love grants us. And so in the end, forgiveness isn't about the oil you put in your diffuser or the way it changes your life. If this parable is any indication, forgiveness may actually cause us to lose more than what we might gain. And isn't that tough? That to actually forgive, it may mean that we lose our capital, that we may lose things that were owed to us. And Lord knows we all feel like something's owed to us right now. Every time that we might wonder if we can get back or we can't do this or we can't do that, we are owed something. Somebody's got to do something about this. But again, if this parable is true, forgiveness may cause us to lose more than we might gain. But Jesus demonstrates that forgiveness is about a love of a person beside us that permeates every fiber of our being, overcoming all of the means in which we lord over each other, even if we have a right to do it. Through unconditional love, we are no longer required to keep track and make amends for each individual wrong and sin, but instead respond to God and the other with the same body-rending compassion we have been given. Our life work becomes the joy and celebration of welcoming one another back in from the cold that we have placed on ourselves, self-determined prodigals all, and erasing the never-ending debts that are impossible to pay back. I will not be able to pay back the debts of sin that I owe literally every single person that I have ever met in my entire life, including each of you that are watching right now. I cannot pay that back, and to be honest, you can't pay back what you owe me either, so why are we trying so darn hard to do it? Christ's presence in the world and his work amongst us as the conduit in which God explains God's self demonstrates this as a reflection of God's own character, and once again are given the freedom to be and not just do. We can enter into the world fully aware of our imperfections, yet given permission to suspend their weight and live into the joy of the work of Jesus Christ. Thanks be to a God who loves us with such overwhelming passion that we are forgiven no matter what our debt. Amen.